Welcome to the last session in the education strand. And also, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Free Speech Union and Academics for Academic Freedom. I always have to remember to say who I am. I'm Dennis Hayes. I'm the Director of Academics for Academic Freedom. We've been taking up issues of free speech since 2006, thousands of cases, and we're going to continue doing it with support from other organisations. But I'd like to introduce the panel, that we've got a fantastic panel, and in the order in which they're going to speak. And so to my immediate right is Alice Sullivan, who's a Professor of Sociology at University College London's Social Research Institute. And she recently co-authored a pamphlet for the Philosophy of Education Society on getting universities to promote academic freedom. It's well worth a read, and it's free. Our second speaker, to my far right, is Rob Lowney, who's an editorial trainee at Unheard and a founding member of Free Speech Champions. Find out more about everybody on the web. Our third speaker is James Orr, to my far left, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy of Religion at the University of Cambridge. Fourth speaker is Anna Keenan, who's a History of Art and English Literature student at Glasgow University and also writes for The New Taboo, of which there are copies on everybody's chair. And Anna spoke at the East Midlands Salon. Very good talk. And our final speaker is Rod Liddle, who everyone knows as a columnist for the Sunday Times and the Sun, and the author of The Great Betrayal, which I suspect might come true in the not too distant future. But I'm so glad it didn't, but now I think it might. So it's about Brexit if you haven't read it. Rod has another distinction of being on our banned list. People who are banned from speaking at universities. Some people hold that like a badge of honour. I'm on the banned list. So you know the format. So 5 minutes or so for every speaker, and then over to you. Alice.
Thank you, Dennis. So I want to start by telling you about an incident of no platforming that happened at UCL last year. So the UCL Student Debating Society planned an event on trans people in women's sports, and they invited a balanced panel to discuss the issue, including a female scientist who believes that sex matters in sports. They also invited an academic from the Gender Studies Department at the LSE. Now, instead of accepting the invitation, this academic told the students that they should cancel the event rather than platform the female scientist. Now, what happened next? The UCL students did what they were told. They complied with the LSE academics' request or demand to shut the event down. Now, that incident didn't receive any publicity at the time, but I was pleased to see it in a report that came out this week from HEPI, talking about the phenomenon of quiet no platforming, so the kind of incidents that we don't usually hear about. But when I first heard about this incident last year, when it happened, I have to admit my reaction was one of just deep frustration with the students. Why on earth were they giving in to this no-mark LSE academic? Why didn't they stand their ground and hold their event? But the fact is these students were frightened of the social ostracism of their peers, frightened of the vicious bullying and harassment that they may reasonably expect if they step out of line. And their fears aren't irrational. So we can all understand how desperately young people want to fit in and be accepted. And if most academics are too afraid to speak the truth on certain subjects, how can we possibly expect students to be brave? 2 reports have come out in recent weeks that give ample evidence that current students think very differently on these issues compared to students even just a few short years ago. So a recent report by the Policy Institute found that 44% of students agree or strongly agree with the statement, "I feel unable to express my views in my university because I'm afraid of disagreeing with my peers." Now that is a travesty of what education is supposed to be. But even more strikingly, that figure was up from 25% in 2019. So that's an incredibly dramatic, rapid shift between 2019 and 2022. A different report by HEPI shows very similar trends over time. So in 2022, 36% of undergraduates believed academics should be fired if they teach material that might heavily offend somebody. And that's up from 15% in 2016. So again, the speed of this attitudinal change is dramatic. It's simply not tenable to argue, as we often hear people argue, that, oh, students have always been a bit annoying, you know, this is nothing to see here, nothing that's really happened. This is a real shift. So what's to be done? Well, I think the first thing I would say is that students don't arrive at university as blank slates. So we need to look at what's happening in schools. Schools have some of the same problems that universities have, with lobby groups such as Mermaids and Stonewall, providing training and providing teaching materials. So we need to sort that out, because indoctrination is not education. But we also need to ask positively of schools what they can do to promote the value of pluralism and productive disagreement in a democracy. Turning to universities, they need to understand the difference between free speech on the one hand and harassment, which is designed to shut down the speech of others, on the other. And I think they've been very bad at making that distinction and have tended to see harassment that's intended to shut down speech as just another form of free speech. It is not. We need to, universities need to make very clear to staff and students who try to shut down legitimate academic discussion that that's not acceptable. And we need to empower our students to say no, whether it's to their peers or to academics who seek to constrain their intellectual horizons. Thank you.
I am hoping today to draw a little bit on my anecdotal experience as a recent graduate, as well as the bio that Dennis so kindly gave me. I graduated from the University of Edinburgh this summer just gone, and I'd like to tell you about something I kind of noticed on that day of graduation, where I looked around as everyone was in their gowns and their finery, lining the streets, and I didn't see a single one of my academic tutors or personal tutors from over my 4 years of study. Now, my actual personal tutor who'd been assigned to me, I met 4 times in 4 years. One of those times was on Zoom, and none of the meetings ever lasted more than 10 minutes. Now, this is not to say that the academics in question are negligent or that they are at fault in any way. Rather, I think there is an ever-deepening chasm between students and their academics at universities. Now, we can put this down to all kinds of things. I mean, universities have been rapidly expanding, increasingly becoming more like businesses than institutions of education. Maybe we could talk about the effects, perhaps, of the Me Too movement, where academics might be worried about getting too close to their students. But either way, there is a gap that is broadening, both in terms of views, attitudes, and the way that these people interact on campus. Now, I think it's really, really very imperative that we have solidarity between students and staff. The ideological gap is not necessarily as broad as papers sometimes make out, nor is it to be seen in terms of a kind of binary or a straightforward generational battle. For instance, there are a great many students on campus who really do believe in free speech and who do want to champion these views. We do hear scare stories like, I'm sure last year you saw the case of Magdalen College, Oxford, the MCR redecorating their common room, by which they took down a portrait of the Queen. And this was reported as a cancellation of the Queen, which I think was somewhat misleading. And by using cases such as that, we risk overlooking the more serious and more chilling cases of free speech being eroded. Now, if we kind of realise that universities do owe their charges a pastoral duty as well as an academic one, it's important that they do not make this a patronising endeavour, that they do not use tokenistic gestures to move that forward. So, for instance, in the course of my English degree at Edinburgh, I was enrolled on a course which dealt with modernist literature. There were authors on it which included James Joyce, Juna Barnes, Jean Rhys, and the homepage for this course was broken down in a way where each author had a list of topics, offensive topics such as racism and animal cruelty, and a tick next to each one which offended that rule. Now, in some cases, this might be vaguely understandable, but one of the categories was pregnancy or childbirth. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never been particularly upset by a pregnant woman in a book. If pastoral care is treated like a creche, then I'm afraid we are not going to move forward. Now, of course, one of the ways that the government is dealing with the free speech crisis is through the Higher Education Bill, the Freedom of Speech Bill, and let's just say that I have quite mixed feelings about it. So the minister currently overseeing higher education is Andrea Jenkins. She recently came out and talked about students preferring Harry Potter studies to engineering. Now, this is annoying and it's puerile and it's reductive if our politicians use these sort of stereotypes too readily rather than engaging with the real concerns. If we make caricatures out of students, bogeymen out of students, we're not going to move forward. Now, the bill is currently going through the Lords, having been through the Commons, and I do hope that it will come to fruition in a way which involves students in this decision making. So, for instance, one of my concerns is that universities won't invite controversial speakers in the first place if they are too beholden to government decree about who can be invited into to speak. So my main points to end really is that I feel that students should be taking this into their own hands. So for instance, I was involved in a lot of student journalism at university. I wrote articles which were read by tens of people, and I would advise students to find any kind of avenue possible, whether that be writing or getting more involved in student unions to kind of shape them and take them away from ideologues who have allowed these institutions to deviate from their real purpose. So I feel like groups like Free Speech Champions, which is directed towards students, and Academics for Academic Freedom, which is of course based on professors, collaboration between those two groups will overcome this. We need bottom-up change, not free speech decreed from above. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, very much, and thank you, Rob and Alice, for those comments. It's a great honour to be here. I'm just going to quickly go through, I've got 4 or 5 minutes, and I'm going to talk about the problem. I don't think I need to talk too much about that, because I think we agreed, at least among the panel, there may be dissent from the floor, that there is a serious problem. And I'm going to talk a little bit about prognosis, but then what I really want to focus on is possibilities. There we go, 3 Ps. I'm sounding like some sort of Anglican preacher or something. But I want us to think about the possibilities. What are the solutions here? What are the antidotes to the chaos that's breaking out across campuses up and down the country? So, look, where are we? Just diagnosing the problem. We all know, I think there have been 150 cancelled speakers over the last 5 or 6 years. I am inclined to believe quite a few people, I think Rob mentioned this earlier, that's actually slightly missing the point. That is to say, it's not illustrative of the kind of deep problem, which is actually a much more structural one. I find these cancellations are very, very useful opportunities to catalyse public attention on the scale and the depth of the crisis in campus life. But it is real, and I'm sitting next to a cancelland, or whatever they call it, a cancellee, and there are plenty of them, and they are egregious, and we must fight every single one of them. Primarily, I think, by simply inviting back or inviting any person who's been cancelled to come and speak at the university, roll out the red carpet. We've started to do that a little bit in Cambridge, and we're going to be intentional about it in the months and years ahead. I think the HEPI data, I'm just going to sort of fling data points at you, but I think that the one HEPI data, the Higher Education Policy Initiative Institute survey from this year was worth bearing in mind is the 61% of students who think that the point of the university is to preserve and uphold psychological well-being, is to make me feel safe, is to coddle me. Now, what's so useful about that survey is, as Alice laid out so well, is that we've got a very neat equivalent survey from 2016 where only 37%, I say only 37% is way too high, but the direction of travel is clear and it's fast. So things are moving very, very fast. And the window of opportunity for the options that I'm going to touch on at the end is closing rapidly. So don't need to go through, I think, more sort of data points. There's plenty of data out there, and the sort of Guardianista line that the free speech crisis is a right-wing conspiracy theory is now, I think, really just dead, done, and dusted. And so I think the prognosis is alarming. I think we are in the midst or at the threshold of nothing short of a cold culture war that is going to be is already ripping through the campuses of this country and is affecting what, as Andrew Sullivan once put it, that what stays on campus, what happens on campus does not stay on campus. This is breaking out as industries and professions and policymakers are realizing that this is filtering out of the university very, very quickly. So, what are the possibilities? What are the solutions? Well, 3 more P's. How about this? Persuasion, provocation, and power. So, persuasion. Can we try to make the rational case for academic freedom? Can we argue for it? Can we stage events where we just talk about freedom? I'm much more skeptical that this is a possibility nowadays. I tend to agree with Jonathan Swift's line that you cannot reason a person out of a position that they were never reasoned into. Nevertheless, we are doing our best. So in Oxford, a group of us have started an initiative in honour of the late and lamented Sir Roger Scruton. We've got 4 lectures in the Sheldonian at the beginning of every academic year, showcasing small c conservative heterodox opinion, starting on Monday, tomorrow that is, come along, Monday, Wednesday next week, Monday, Wednesday the following week, and we've just booked the Sheldonian up to and including 2028, thanks to some generous support. Now that, I should say, is a completely independent initiative. That is to say, the way we set it up was to make sure that it was not in any way under the jurisdiction of the University of Oxford. That is to say, it's a mob-proof, Don-proof, HR-proof, committee-proof project. Now, so it is in the university, but not of the university. And I'm afraid that is the only way any significant antidote is going to work. So that's persuasion. I think limited value, but worth pursuing it nevertheless. Provocation, second P. We need to provoke. So universities don't invite controversial speakers. Universities don't invite anybody. Academics do. Individuals do. And so it means that we need people like Eric and Arif and myself and people dotted around this room to just say, right, we're going to invite this person. We know they're going to be controversial. We know it's going to provoke a tantrum. I'm going to keep provoking those tantrums until the students learn that rule by censorious mob is over in our universities. We've got to keep fighting that, and it's really not up to the institutions. It's up to the individuals in the institutions to put their head above the parapet. Certainly those of us who are fortunate enough to have de facto tenure. But there is no excuse for the spinelessness that we're seeing across, thousands of colleagues at Cambridge. I've been in Cambridge, 4 or 5 years. I've found I could count on 2 hands the number of colleagues who are willing to stick their neck above the parapet and invite a controversial speaker and stage a controversial debate. But we just got to do that, got to keep doing that. Finally, power. We've got to use the power available to us. This is why Rob's criticisms aside, and I think they are valid, we've got to press ahead with the new bill. We've got to make sure that the statutory guidance accompanying the bill clarifies what best practice looks like from the universities, what is involved in actively promoting academic freedom for vice chancellors, and there've got to be fines. The new director has got to be willing to deploy those the sticks available to him. And then so that's government, but there's also private donors need to stop giving money, or they need to give money with careful conditions attached, and they mustn't give large lump sums. So they've got to, if possible, give in staggered, phased donations with tight purse strings attached to that. And then finally, media. The media landscape in the UK is far, far better and more balanced and representative of general public opinion than it is, say, in the United States. So the media has been a huge help to us in Cambridge and in Oxford and I think elsewhere in really focusing public attention on the madness inside the asylum. And that has really, that sort of filtered out into the policy space and is bringing about real results. And although as bad as things are in the UK, in relative terms, they are far better than any other developed democracy in the English-speaking world. Thank you.
As a current humanities student, I want to give my perspective on what it feels like to be on campus at the moment. So university for me currently feels like a place of two camps, two tribes even. On the one hand, we have those who intuitively feel the free speech issue and recognise it to be underpinning a lot of their experiences, and on the other, those who just simply don't. This is because those who adhere to the status quo and hold progressive views such as on issues such as race and decolonisation or gender and pronouns or climate change are never put in situations in which their views are labelled as inappropriate or bigoted and are implicitly shut out. In fact, their views are endorsed and promoted by the university. Those who adopt the status quo don't realise or acknowledge that there is a problem because their free speech is never curtailed. This makes it tricky for those of us who might have disagreements with the status quo, as we have to out ourselves as bigots. These views are particularly difficult to articulate considering that so many of the changes that one might take issue with, pronouns declared in emails, for example, are now so casually integrated into the mesh of the institution. And if you see these be tied up with a broader negative trend of social justice activism, it's very hard to discuss them in and of themselves without stirring up controversy. I think this tension evidently firstly has its roots in the institution being captured by a certain politics, and secondly by the institutionalized risk aversion that is an integral part of the politics itself, the risk being that of causing offence or harm. I recently wrote a piece for Free Speech Champions, of which I'm a part of, about trigger warnings in literature studies, arguing that they interfere with students having authentic, unregulated, and spontaneous responses to literature. This was in response to a Times study that found that over 1,000 texts have been branded with trigger warnings at undergraduate level for things as simple as blood or pain. I believe this to be a small aggregate of a free speech issue on campus because their use is symptomatic of the risk aversion. In an attempt to minimise the risk of harm, academics preempt the responses of students, which subsequently corrals them into certain interpretations. I argue that in this dynamic, the reader's feelings, not the characters or authors, assume priority, such that the text becomes a mirror of themselves, and instead of challenging the reader's worldview and experiences, it abruptly meets them where they already are. Unfortunately, I think that this attitude has permeated the university as a whole, and the supposed vulnerability of students has become a subtle yet potent influence on the approach to teaching. In practice, this means that academics propagate a lot of these politics, often vacuously, making gestural apologetic comments about the white dead male trope or canonical references that feature in their courses, for example. Unsurprisingly, I don't buy these, as if they were sincere, they would do well to change their course or research speciality. Yet the mere attempt to acknowledge problematic content is still there, I would say, to protect themselves from the criticism that they expect to face if they didn't. In the classroom, this is indicative of an erosion of academic authority in which the roles are reversed and the assumed view of the students are what dictate the tone of many conversations. So this leads me on to what young people themselves can do to combat some of these issues. Ultimately, it comes down to having confidence in starting conversations. Conversations that will acknowledge how free speech issues subtly affect the university experience by chilling debate, why cancelling speakers and firing academics isn't a useful method for challenging views you don't like, why trigger warnings aren't simply only ensuring the well-being of students, and why institutions probably shouldn't be aiming for this over intellectual stimulation anyway. I think it's also necessary to show academics if you don't buy their gestural politics, because in my experience, these banal points end up making it less clear what they really think. We should question them, hopefully to reassure them that you think white dead men's theories are great because they changed the world or clarified something important, rather than just nodding along. Pushing this is often worth it to hear their sigh of relief in knowing that they don't have to walk on eggshells and that the conversation can go beyond this tired point. We should, however, also remember, as Alice has said, that undergraduates are really young and it can be intimidating to be wrong, especially when the culture threatens to ostracize anyone who says the wrong things. We want to avoid demonizing young people as snowflakes and should recognize that often their disengagement from this issue could reveal more about their insecurity than it does about their intolerance. To combat this, I think we should refocus on arguing why the quest for knowledge and the thrill of learning for fun, rather than to be on the right side of history, is important, and remind young people that healthy disagreement is a stepping stone on this journey. Lastly, young people should have trust in each other, because having fallings out and being cancelled is a lot less common than we may have led ourselves to believe. In my experience on campus, in the classroom, many young people are willing to have complex conversations. It may just be that the boundaries of this conversation has closed. Opening these boundaries up again may be tedious work, but it will gradually engage other young people in the debate and at the very least make classes more interesting. So to students in the room, be open, be confident, and speak up.
I was actually asked to speak at Durham University about a year ago, just under a year ago, and I was aware upon receiving this invitation that it might be a bit problematic here or there. So in delivering my speech to the students, I went out of my way to be as gratuitously offensive to their worldview as I possibly could. And around about 18% walked out. It's what happened next that the problem is. Because frankly, if I had been invited to a lecture given by Rob Liddell when I was 18, I would have walked out. It's what happened next. It was the pusillanimity of the academic staff. I don't blame the kids one bit. They can be intolerant if they wish to be. I was probably a bit intolerant at that age. I don't mind them walking out. I didn't mind the people who stayed and looked cross and didn't agree. You know, I preferred that approach. It was the academic staff which, in this desperately cringing kind of BBC Three presenter manner, tried to cozy up to this tiny minority, small minority of students who had not wanted me to be at the university at all. And to the degree that the job of the chap who had invited me, a long-term friend and the professor of journalism at Durham University, his job seemed to be on the line for quite some time until mercifully the Free Speech Union stepped in. And it is the behaviour of the university authorities and the dons that bothers me far more than the behaviour of the students, despite those slightly worrying statistics which my fellow panellists have put up before. I ought to reveal that, just as James has suggested, I have been invited back to speak at Durham University in 2 weeks, 3 weeks' time, and I shall go out of my way to be as gratuitously offensive to their worldview again. That invitation back was at the behest of the students. It was not at the behest of the university authorities, who I dare say are already, in some degree, discombobulated by this invitation. All I would say, in addition to what I've already said in terms of you know what we can do, the political party of which I'm a part, the Social Democratic Party, has produced a charter for students, and it's a freedom of speech charter for students. And it would there are 10 points on it, and I was involved in drawing up what these points should be. They include a right for students, when they are studying any subject whatsoever, to have a plurality of views given to them by their lecturers, rather than the monoculture which too often, particularly in the humanities, pertains. They would also have a right to be marked in their exams according to how good their essays are, rather than as to what political position they adopted in those. And believe me, I've had countless letters from students, distraught students, genuinely distraught students, who have written essays on such subjects as transgenderism or Israel, which is, I would put second on the list of kind of toxic subjects, and Black Lives Matter, decolonization, etc., who have been marked down and told, you cannot say that. They've been told it quite clearly by their lecturers. You know, you cannot possess that point of view. And I've heard that as well from my son, who's just completed an MA in History of Kings. So those are two things which we can do. One of which is to guarantee for all students, on pain of withdrawal of funding from these universities, that they must have a plurality of views. That is what a university is for. When I went to university as a very left-wing kid at the age of 20 and found out that such a thing as sociobiology existed, which these days I suppose is called evolutionary psychology, but it's pretty much the same thing. It changed my worldview. University was able to change my worldview on a number of issues. Today, all it seems to do is to reinforce one particular worldview, and I think that is an enormous problem. But I think the government needs to get involved. This is why we have our charter. I think funding, because universities, as James has said, are dependent upon funding, and I like the idea of staggered awards. But don't forget that the corporate people who are giving these awards are as egregiously infected with this appalling lack of respect for freedom of speech, as are the universities themselves. As James has said, it has leaked out well beyond the university campuses. But I would say, vote SDP is the obvious answer to this. But thank you.
I'm going to come out to the audience just to say, I rather appreciate this, because I work at a university where 70% of the voters are Brexit supporters. Not one student dare speak. Sky News came, and we tried to get the students to speak. We did eventually find some, but they were frightened of speaking. But there is an issue that seems to me to come out with all these reports, having done this spiked free speech rankings, and with survey after survey is coming out, and policy after policy about what everybody else should do. So is it that we need more policies and more intervention, or is it, as Anna said, time to get students just to speak up and have the courage? So over to you. We need to look at solutions.
So I too have been cancelled by universities, but mostly it's been behind the scenes, and that's the way that it works. So I was invited by Cambridge Union last year, and then they just ghosted me. But I would say that it's not just universities, and I think the framing that it's leaking out from universities is possibly the wrong framing. It's everywhere. Universities are getting the flack. BBC, I'm informally blacklisted. ITV, I'm informally blacklisted. Sky has recorded me and then dropped it. Australia Broadcasting Corporation, Irish Times has interviewed me and dropped it. Schools Week got me to write an article and then canned it. That's my life now. Wasting my time writing things, usually for no money, and then getting it canned. So if it's in all the institutions, if it's in the media, then I don't know why we particularly are complaining about the universities. These people with jobs, who have jobs, places like the BBC, they're the ones who I blame the most. And the second thing I'd say is that provocation is really the only way, and this doesn't come as naturally maybe to me as to Rod, because I'm not naturally somebody who turns up to be offensive. But luckily for me, just saying that there are about two sexes and that you can't change sex turns out to be the most offensive thing that you can possibly do.
Just about.
So on Tuesday week, 9 days' time, Arif Ahmed has invited me to Keyes College, and I'm turning up and saying that.
Yes, good,
And let's see
good
what
for you.
happens. And we are just and if we do that, then we will stop the shouting, I think. It's like toddlers.
Yeah, I'm an associate lecturer in management and business. This is probably going to be my last couple of months in education. I'd rather do consulting, to be honest. But the point I'd like to make, and some of the younger undergraduates here, that the issue that I've seen is actually the consumerisation of university, which is a layer within this, is that we are told consistently it's about student happiness, it's about student continuing the course, and there is no chance of doing any kind of discomfort. Probably like what I studied in the 90s, I studied law in the 90s, there was a lot of discomfort in it, but that is part of the process. What I get told is that it's about undergraduate happiness. And I think this comes through to a life thing as well, is the obsession that everyone has to be happy all the time.
Yeah.
But if you study positive psychology, you realise that is the road to anxiety and stress. Because actually true happiness is to challenge and overcoming difficulty. But unfortunately, I think the only way I can treat it in my class is the first 3 lectures of the year. I basically say, look, this is going to be a tough time. University is tough. This course is tough. And I think most undergraduates who are they appreciate that.
Yeah.
But I'm told you can't do that. I get pushed back, and so I'm sick of it. I'm thinking, look, as someone who worked 20 years in business, I'm trying to help people get a job. But I'm told, well, you can't say that because it's all about them being happy. I said, well, try working in marketing. It's not to be happy every day.
I was cancelled by the environmental charity Friends of the Earth for asking a question that they didn't like at an event. But I think, is it a good idea to, this kind of Bill of Rights thing they have in America, freedom of speech is refined and defined, and why is there no campaign to say, like, the Malicious Communication Act, if you send someone a text message that causes distress, that is a criminal offence and the police can be involved in that. The online safety bill would make a 2-year prison sentence for causing severe distress without any psychological action. So I think perhaps a list of laws we want to get rid of, and one law which guarantees freedom of speech that at least goes, beneath inciting violence and racial hatred. Freedom of speech enshrined in a law would be a great idea to campaign for. Thank you.
Question for the free speech champion, Rob and Anna. You're both working on getting more awareness on the issue in university and getting people involved. Have you seen any positive changes recently, or do we need more mass behind this issue?
What a mess. I was the first in my family to go to university to read English in the mid-80s, and I don't think a single academic would have been so pathetic as to patronise me by saying, I need a trigger warning on As You Like It, Sound of the Fury. What has happened? What about indoctrination in schools? And you meant the word spinelessness and certain academics and the emergency. I think that's where we are. Maybe we need to march, but it is really serious. And the rot's been going on so long. My two left Bristol in 7 or 8 years ago, and it was starting there, and it's just speeded up.
Thank you, everyone. I would be curious. I've been at a different speech earlier where Peter Whittle explained how 90% of the academics are now on the left side, which means that no matter how much students will speak up, you will be persecuted in your grades, which we've seen, and you saw in your letters, and I've been in university 10 years ago and it was the same thing. Is there a way, every time I go on a panel, there's sort of, we need exactly this sort of like equal number of women and men and this races and this sexes and so on. Is there a way where we can actually, not offend that, but is there a way where we can actually ask academics when we hire them to have some sort of a balance of diversity of opinions in the academic sphere by hiring some sort of a proportionate level I don't know if you can find that though, but it would be lovely if we could.
Thank you.
On that last point, I don't see this actually as a left-right issue because, I'm on the left and I'm a social scientist who believes that social science should be about the pursuit of truth. And I've got into a lot of trouble for saying that we should collect data on sex, which within my world is a deeply uncontroversial thing to say. So I haven't been attacked from within the quantitative social science community, but I've been attacked by postmodernists in, theatre studies or in gender studies departments who just don't believe that academia is about the pursuit of truth. So I don't want recruitment panels to be asking people, are you left-wing or right-wing? I think that would be awful. But I don't think we should have academic departments where people are not interested in truth and are only interested in activism.
Thank you.
So, question about decolonisation. What I find really fascinating about the decolonisation movement is that quite often their proponents share a lot of aims with the people they attack, only they frame it in different language. So the decolonisation movement is at heart just about diversifying the curriculum, which a lot of us can really get behind. But by couching it in the language of guilt and recrimination, it's just entirely counterproductive. Now, during my time at Edinburgh, one of the university's buildings, David Hume Tower, named after, among our greatest alumni, was renamed because of his, not very oft expressed, but nonetheless expressed views on race, which we'd considered not just dated, but extremely racist. One of the proposed names for the tower to be changed to was Julius Nyerere Tower. Now, I don't know if there are any historians of Africa in here, but Julius Nyerere was a Tanzanian dictator who imprisoned political prisoners and homosexuals. So I feel like it would only have been a matter of time before he too fell. Further on the question of decolonisation, I think it's worthwhile to kind of differentiate between different university subjects. So in the case of something like history, where quite often we previously viewed things through a very Anglo-centric lens, I think it's useful to add voices to the discussion. However, on my degree, doing English, it was done in a way which removed voices from the discussion because they went against progressive norms. And I think that's absurd to try and, say that Geoffrey Chaucer is a horrendous misogynist because of something he said in the 14th century. It's just not, we don't learn and we don't engage with viewpoints which are alien to us and which are illustrative of the past.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for accepting the invitation to come back to Cambridge next week, and well done to Ara for making it possible. I just think that's fantastic. So provocation is more important than persuasion at this stage, and we need to start thinking of our universities not as virtue signalling institutions, but as vice signalling institutions. And by that I mean universities need to learn that they've got to be able to do the unpopular things. That is to say, inviting cancelled speakers, but doing it consciously, making clear that there's balance in the appointment processes. I mean, I'm wary of in reverse diversity statements, or even buying into the language of diversity when it comes to sort of diversity of viewpoint. Nevertheless, I think it's crucial for us to wake up to the fact that the gatekeeping at the level of appointments of professors and permanent lecturers and so on is very tight, is very ideologically filtered, as it were. And so as the sort of liberal boomers retire, the activist zoomers are coming in. And so it's a kind of ratchet effect. And so as I said earlier, things are going to go a lot worse before they get better. Groupthink, somebody talked about groupthink, absolutely couldn't agree more. The problem with groupthink is that wrongthink becomes evilthink, and disagreement becomes something that is morally suspect, and the sort of the demonizing of minority viewpoints gets worse and worse, and we're seeing an awful lot of that.
So to the guy who asked about how it's going, I would say that marginal gains, but making progress. I think that what's really tricky about this discussion on campus is that you can't really talk about it through the lens of free speech. It's more complex than that. Over my 3 years of being at uni now, I never start a conversation with people through that lens. I never say, oh, have you thought about free speech on campus? You have to be more clever about it. You have to think, well, what do you think about trigger warnings? Or have you noticed how this course is designed quite specifically and quite ideologically? Or have you noticed they took this book off the reading list for some reason? You have to be a bit clever about it, which is quite tricky because you have to be thinking about how do these free speech issues kind of filter down and affect the course design and the academics' attitude, and all these things at a much more kind of intricate level. So I would say that it's slow but steady, and starting conversations with students about anything in this realm is useful. But it's been really useful being the Free Speech Champions to kind of have a bit of a basis. So I go do a plug now, I guess. We've got magazines, join our campaign, follow us on Twitter, that sort of thing. But it is more difficult, I would say, because you have to see beyond just it being, oh, people are cancelled, that's bad. It's a lot more difficult in reality with people in classrooms.
On the issue of Hume, who you seem to be pleased that he was replaced.
No, not at all. You misunderstanding.
I mean, he was a racist because he lived a long time ago. It really is that simple. And that's the problem of university campuses nowadays, and indeed of this particular tranche of thought from the left, and I'm afraid it is the left largely, which is everything is seen through the tyranny of now. From the tyranny of now, and we are pristine now, of course, or these particular people are pristine and do no wrong, and so Hume can be cancelled, just as Martin Luther King can be cancelled for his somewhat gamey views on homosexuality, or indeed Gandhi, who was also, of course, a racist. But it's an absurdity, and that's what I wanted to come back to, really, which is the crucial point, which is that there is a reason for non-platforming. And there is a reason for the closing down of debate. And it's a very simple reason when you look at it, which is that this identitarian politics idea has no substance to it. And you have to close down debate, because as soon as you ask those hard questions about does sex matter? What is a woman? What is a man? And so on. As soon as you start picking away at critical race theory, it collapses like a pink mohair jumper knitted by an imbecile. It just unravels. And that is the main reason that they do close down these debates, because it cannot abide debate, because it cannot survive debate. So it is a very difficult thing to argue with them, because it is against their whole interest. And that goes not just for universities, but for the social justice warriors in the BBC and Ofsted and everywhere else.
The root of the problem, if you will, because from my perspective, it seems like I didn't see a lot of it when I was in university. I only saw a little bit of it starting to crop up. My university was very left-wing back in Denmark. But I was wondering about, because it seems to me that it's only a fairly small minority that really believes fervently in, let's say, wokeism and cancellation culture and these things here. I heard someone mention like institutionalized risk aversity. So I get the sense that that might be the root of the problem, because the majority are just risk averse and do not want to lose their jobs. So how do we combat that in a sense? Because that seems to be a more deep-rooted problem and a more like collective anxiety that I believe is exasperating this here, but you might disagree, I don't know.
Anna, in her opening, was talking about the presumed views of students. I think that's a beautiful phrase. And because I think academics are hiding behind student skirts all the time,
Yes.
I think they're saying the students want this, so this is what we've got to give you. And on that, I've got a couple of good news stories from Imperial College, and I'll be very brief about them. One was that in the wake of Black Lives Matter, the university management resourced a kind of committee of inquiry into the history and culture of Imperial College. We're called Imperial. People worked there, were famous in evolution, in genetics. And they produced a report saying that we should rename 3 buildings. So T.H. Huxley, JBS Haldane, R.S. Fisher. Any scientists in the room will know how eminent those people were. They're some of the best scientists that Britain ever produced. So their names had to go, and we had to remove the statue of T.H. Huxley. There was a fight back, so a small group of academics asked persistent questions that amounted to kind of freedom of information requests. So what was said in the focus groups? How many people sent emails? Can we see the anonymized emails that were sent? And we managed to get hold of all this material, and when we did an analysis of it, we found that the people against renaming outnumbered the renamers by 9-1.
Wow, wow.
9-1, but that was not at all the picture that the university was giving us, or the picture that the paid consultants who wrote the report were giving us. They were all telling us a completely different picture. So by just asking for the data and keep asking for it, and if there are town hall meetings, just keep bringing it up. And a very short good news story just the last week. Imperial funds small research projects for syllabus change. So academics and students get together. And an engineering lecturer went to her students and said, I think we need to decolonize maths. Why do we keep talking about Pythagoras' theorem? Because it was discovered by Baudhayana in India, and it was discovered by Gogo in China. And to her consternation, her engineering students were not in the least interested in decolonizing the maths curriculum. What they said was, we need more help with our maths. well, duh. I mean, wasn't that their job? Because some of them didn't do further maths before they came. And I think she was genuinely surprised to find that students wanted academic help, not therapy, well-being, and decolonisation. Go for it.
Just on this point.
Excellent panel. Just I'll try and keep it quick. 3 possible policy options. I'd like to hear your thoughts. First, University of Chicago Calvin report suggests that universities should not be taking any political positions because that has a knock-on on academic freedom. Should universities adopt that policy? Number 2 is, should universities be explicit about barring political discrimination in hiring? That's also not mentioned in any university documents. Number 3, what I would call equivalent action. Anything you do on race and gender diversity, equity, inclusion, you must do on political equity, diversity, and inclusion. So if you want to do 0, you can do 0 for both, but you can't do one at the exclusion of the other.
Hi, just 2 points really. In terms of what do we do, set up an AFAF, Academic for Academic group in your university. That's what we did at Derby, and it doesn't take anything. 5 of us got together, we declared that we exist now, we put an announcement out, and hell broke loose. I mean, we fought 2-3 months about not being closed down. Luckily, we had the support of our Vice-Chancellor. But just do it. If every university has an academic for academic freedom group, we have more power, power in numbers. The second point, which is partly from what we learned setting up the group, I hear a lot of blaming of the academics, and yes, many academics do need to be blamed, but the main people who actually opposed our group was librarians. Equality and diversity committee members. It was very, very the academic. So surprise, surprise, but an interesting point.
I've got everybody who's got their hands up and.
Yeah. So I think my point kind of addresses James' first comment where he said this thing about 61% of students wanting safety. And then you said they basically want to be coddled. And I think the thing is, no one is pointing out to the students that is coddling. They kind of hear safety and they're like, we like safety. And I think the thing is, you said something before about being smart about it, like pointing things out. And I think one of the things is like saying, don't you think that's a bit patronizing? Like instead of saying they want to be coddled, I don't think they do. They just don't know that that's what this is leading to. And Alice, you said that if academics aren't being brave, how can we expect students to? I think we should. Like, I think students are exactly the ones that should be brave. We don't have much, I know we have our future on the line, but as a student, we're not going to lose our jobs. We're not likely to be kicked off campus because we express a view. And I think we should. And I think for me, just coming to this event makes me want to go back to my university and be a bit more brave, because I think this has made me realize how important it is. I knew, but now I know that other people feel the same way, and I want to go back and challenge it more.
I mean, I'm actually curious to hear from Rob and Anna, because I'd really like to know the students' view of this. So one thing we've been thinking about in Cambridge that seems to have some institutional support is a kind of free speech induction. So part of when you come to university, a bit like fire safety regulations or consent, teaching about consent, you get your free speech. You're grown-ups now, and it's different, and this is what you're going to get, and you're going to be shocked and afraid to deal with it.
Yeah.
Is that something you think, particularly interested in the students' view, the students think would help? And more generally, what else do you think that we as academics can be saying to the students that's going to be most effective?
My comment reflects sort of the overspill outside of education and quite how insidious this whole problem is. In 2016, TfL unveiled a very lovely statue right inside Piccadilly Circus Station. It's very lovely to see. It's very large and very visible. And you read its detail, and it's quotes from Frank Pick, who was one of the masterminds of the underground system, who said, immortality is greater than beauty, perfection is greater than utility, righteousness is better than goodness. And the fourth one, which is really quite alarming, and this is in beautiful brass lettering, which is that wisdom is better than truth. And that is a massive sculpture that TfL unveiled 6 years ago.
See it, say it, sort it.
I can't help noticing, however, that you all agree, and that we at least do need to see what arguments are used by those who disagree with you. I think one argument we've often heard, well, there are two arguments. One is that this cancellation stuff isn't happening. Disinvitation is just not being invited, and nobody has the right to be invited. That sort of argument. But more substantially, there's a moral argument that says, when people portray things as being cancellations or suppressions, what is really going on is that we're trying to amplify the voices of the marginalized. So in other words, we're pro-free speech. And sometimes to be pro-free speech, if you're in good faith, you do sometimes have to tone down the voices of the powerful. So it's all about power dynamics. I'll give you an example. I'm under very moderate pressure, very small pressure actually, where I teach, to add in my reading list, I teach an introductory ethics course, that a reading by a woman and or a minority person. I've so far dodged this Not because I particularly object to it, but because I'm probably too lazy and too lacking in knowledge of who to add, and I haven't been pressed. But if I were to say, do this, and they say, well, why not? And I would say, well, I don't really know. They say, look, we're trying to amplify, we're trying to widen the range of views. What do you say to that sort of argument in good faith?
It's Alistair Donald. I run a summer school for under 30-year-olds called Living Freedom. So anybody who's interested in this stuff can come along to that school. But I just wanted to say that the further we go down the road of the erosion of freedom within universities, the less and less convinced I am about the means to tackle it is to identify it as a problem of the left. It just seems to me that if you think about what's going on in universities, and I have a lot of sympathy with the point that Alice made about truth, actually. I mean, it might be the case that the relativism and the kind of rejection of the pursuit of truth had their roots on the left. But today, it's the university itself, it's the intellectual institutions of society itself that have absorbed these values and spout them out again. And once you erode that idea that you can actually have a debate in the pursuit of something that's important, then it's inevitable that once you absorb the kind of need to have specified outcomes, you will erode the free speech. So I think, you know, we have to think about new ways to present some of what's going on just now, rather than just rely on it as being something that's a problem of the left. I think it's much, much bigger than that, and we need to work out how it is that we get that across.
I think it is a problem primarily of the left. That's why I took exception to the suggestion that it wasn't a left-right divide. I mean, I consider myself on the left, certainly on economic issues. So, you know, it's uncomfortable. But I think that this whole thing, I mean, it's complex in a way. If you want to go back and find out where it came from, I think it came from a kind of conflation of two things, one from the left and the right, the 1960s Frankfurt school of post-Marxism, and then the 1980s school of Chicago economics, both of which, even though they seem to be opposed to each other, are kind of about the individual and about giving the individual his freedom and laissez-faire economics, and also let it all hang out politics from the 60s. But that's a debate for another day. I mean, to the chap over there who was talking about, yes, we're all in agreement here. It's a very simple answer to that, and we were talking about this before the debate began, because it's something I've found with the battle of ideas generally, that it does tend to be all people from one side. It's because the others would boycott it, that they would not turn up. You know, they would see that I was on a panel, or that Alice was on a panel, and they would say, oh no, we're not having any of that. We can't be seen in the company of those people. They simply will not debate.
One thing about safety I think is really interesting. King's College London did a report recently about free speech on campuses and universities, and they found that while 50% of students agree that it's important for universities to allow for all ideas and opinions to be expressed, even if this means some people being offended, they also found that 60% would disagree if it meant that some students felt unsafe. I think it's really bizarre that students have got very confused about safety versus offence. I don't think that campuses are unsafe, or content that you learn on campuses is inherently unsafe. I don't really know what students mean by that, but they have seemed to have adopted this quite broadly. I think it's in kind of just a gesture act of kindness, wanting to be understanding to people. But
no, they do use that, don't they? It's always unsafe. The people who got rid of me from Durham, the guy in charge of leading the resistance said, I've never felt more unsafe than when and I just thought, what? But no, you're right, sorry.
I'll come out on that as well. I think in essence, yes, I like the idea. I think that it's slightly more complicated though, because in classes, actually students don't really want to talk about controversial culture war issues, and that's the problem. If you set it up as we're all going to be very welcoming to each other's ideas here, done, great. But you know, it actually gets very tedious talking about a lot of these really controversial issues in a classroom when you just want to talk about a book or art or whatever. Actually, I've noticed that students are actually quite disengaged from quite controversial topics. So, for example, I study history of art, and we were talking about the Colston statue in a lecture about iconoclasm this week. And students, they just weren't that interested. I was really surprised. They weren't no one actually was like, no, I think they should have taken it down. They just didn't really care. And I think it's because they're just a bit bored of it, and they want to just talk about, you know, arts.
Just quickly to the gentleman in the corner, let me just urge you to die on that hill and treat that as a red line. And the reason you need to treat it as a red line is that as soon as you change one author on the basis of something other than pedagogical merit, you've lost. You've lost the argument. You're down the slippery slope. So as soon as you're including on your ethics, introduction to ethics course, Elizabeth Anscombe, not because of her caliber as a philosopher, which is indisputable, but because of her anatomy and her chromosomes, you have effectively let in the Trojan horse of the whole identitarian agenda. And you're effectively saying to every female in your class that Anscombe is for you, but Plato isn't, and Aristotle isn't. And what you're then signing up to, effectively, is a vision of the humanities that dehumanizes. That is to say, a vision of the humanities that's not something that helps us all students to come together shoulder to shoulder and gaze out at what we all hold in common in our common humanity, but to see on the whole identitarian representational logic of Plato's for me if I'm a white European bloke. Anscombe's the only one, and the whole thing unravels. So please die on that hill.
Thanks, James.
In regards to Arif, your question, you compared this idea of free speech training to a kind of fire drill training, and I fear that it might go the same way in that it would be met with eye rolls and people flicking through their phones. Now, unfortunately, I think this needs to be reframed as looking at free speech in practice rather than in theory. It needs, as Anna has suggested, to be, taken by students and enacted within lectures and within their extracurricular activities, not just treated as a dry academic topic. Not that that's necessarily what your proposal was, but I feel like it needs to be destigmatized at its root rather than in the lecture hall necessarily. In regards to the point about the left, now, even though both left and right practice cancel culture, maybe in varying degrees, the left tend to use this term accountability culture. They are so incredibly resistant to the idea of cancellation at all. Now, if they keep on in this vein on accountability, I wonder what they would do as soon as the right practice cancel culture. Would they then call that accountability? They're driving themselves into, up against a wall, and by being more open about these things, we would be able to criticise equally rather than making it a partisan issue, which it increasingly has.
I'd like to answer the first question, which was about what is the root of the problem, given that it's actually a very small minority of academics who really do want to shut everybody else up and restrict the range of views that can be expressed. I think that's absolutely right. And I also agree with the guy from Imperial who said this isn't happening because the students are demanding it. I think it's happening because of a small number of activists and the way that small number of activists, academics and other staff, actually, because the lady from Derby who mentioned the staff in all sorts of other roles who might be getting involved with this is absolutely right as well. It's about EDI structures and staff activist networks having a lot of power within institutions. So I can give you one example of that. I'm part of a group at UCL called UCL Women's Liberation, and we hosted an event in 2020 to celebrate 50 years of women's liberation, the anniversary of the first Women's Liberation Conference. And a group of what at UCL are called EDI Vice Deans organised a public letter to try and shut the event down. They caused a lot of problems for us. They publicised their letter in the student press. Hardly anyone signed this letter. UCL is a huge organisation, thousands and thousands of students. Very modest numbers signed it, and yet they managed to cause such problems for us. We were told that we had to have counter views expressed. So, for example, if you've got a session on opposing violence against women, you've got to have someone who's in favour of violence against women. It was extraordinary, and it was partly the LGBT networks that feed into this. And one of the really interesting things about the conference was I have never seen so many obvious lesbians in one place in UCL as at this conference, but they're the wrong kind of lesbians. So there's very interesting things going on in EDI and universities. We've been talking about the students, but I think there's a whole conversation that needs to happen about EDI.
I work for the Free Speech Union, which is an incredibly luxurious job after having spent 20 years in academia. I just, I do object actually. I agree with Alistair that I do think it's really unhelpful to pose this as a left-right thing. It's not that it isn't, but I do think the left is not homogenous. And having worked with academics for 20 years, you know, when you say left, they're not all, the left is not just the wokies. And actually lots of people who would consider themselves left in the academic context are just, you know, they're not prepared to side with the right. And so the more you pose this in left-right terms, you're not going to win them to the case for free speech and tolerance. So I do, and I think it's really unhelpful for students because by implication, by arguing for free speech, they get immediately cast as being right-wing. And they're not, and they don't want to be, because they know that's even more toxic than being pro-free speech. And I think that, you know, the free speech brand, if you like, has been rendered toxic by the previous struggles over free speech, and somehow it's got to be reinvented, and it may have to use different terminology, as Anna suggests. But I do think that, you know, kind of trying to advocate for a pendulum swing or a kind of purge is just really, really unhelpful for academics and students.
Yeah, I would reiterate that the dangers of going down a route of left and right. I've experienced academic freedom issues coming from both the left and the right, if one wants to think of it. I think the best way of thinking about it is in terms of risk society, or that question of risk-averse institutions. And those questions transcend left and right. And I think what's happened in universities, there's been a pincer movement in terms of what one might call security and safety. And there's been squeezing of academic freedom, both in the name of security and safety. And what do they have in common? Risk aversion. That's the key critical issue. I think the interesting thing is, people have spoken about the humanities a lot. The irony is that trigger warnings, etc., first came in to the humanities in relation to fictional or artistic representations of dangerous subjects of violence and so on. They came very late to, very much later to medicine or international politics, where we deal with a real world, a world of war, conflict, and trauma. And I would say that my strongest colleagues in terms of defending academic freedom are those colleagues who study China and Russia, and then their threats to academic freedom, and also our students, don't just come internally, but externally. And those are the greatest defenders of freedom, and it transcends left and right.
I was at Debating Matters yesterday. There was like 40 or 50 students, all desperate to speak and arguing really well. So there is something good about sort of things that Anna and Rob have been saying, that students might do it for themselves.
I'll come back to the point that Piers made about amplifying the voices of the marginalised. You said that was a good faith argument. I really don't think it is. I think that, especially when in my own institution, what I've experienced is people trying to shut women's voices down. Where are the voices marginalised there? And so I think that ties in also to this left-right issue. I completely agree with everyone who said that's such an unhelpful framing. The support for the pursuit of truth and a materialist analysis of the world is not a left-right issue, and the marginalised are the people who need free speech the most.
On the point about students wanting to be happy all the time, I completely agree. I think wider happiness and fulfillment comes from being tested and from having your assumptions challenged. And so universities really need to move to make that a more central part of the experience again. So good point about consumerization, forget the money, make it an academic institution first and foremost. And very last thing, students do have very, real concerns about being socially ostracized. So I think your point about, they're not under the same pressure as adults, I don't think that's entirely fair. I think they are right to be worried. But if this, comes from ground level, I think they can absolutely overcome.
James?
Thank you. Well, I think we need to think hard about making the case that the humanities should be not a mirror in which contingent physiological characteristics are seen reflected back on students, but a window onto our common humanity, a window onto the world, a window onto reality that prepares students to be good citizens and fine members of society. I think we need to keep trying to persuade, we need to keep provoking, and we need to keep using whatever levers of power are available to us in the media, in government, through private donors, and so on. And finally, we need to think hard about reforming, not just reforming the universities from within, but thinking about setting up new institutions, new centres in the universities, but not of the universities. And finally, I think we need to be leveraging more the power of networks like this one. Institutions are slow, lumbering, easily captured. Networks are nimble, high in trust, can reconfigure themselves very, very easily, and that's why it's been such a pleasure to be part of this weekend. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, I think also something that's quite difficult to grapple with in the classroom is that when you talk about these issues, you almost come across conspiratorial. A lot of people are just kind of like, what are you talking about? These big free speech issues, they don't see it often if they've not been cancelled or they're not plugged into these debates. And I think that's why it's so important to talk about the minute practical manifestations and to frame it as a free speech issue. Because otherwise, a lot of people they're just not interested. They don't see it. They just want to get on with their studies and they're not seeing the threat to their studies in that way. So lastly, I've got to plug the Free Speech Champions followers. We're moving on to Substack. We're looking for writers. So anyone who's young, interested in these things, contact us and we will publish your work.
I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. We've talked a lot about the pursuit of truth. Well, let's have some truth. Whether you like it or not, Jan and Alice, it is from the left that this comes. I'm really sorry. You may wish that it did not, but it does. And if you look at almost every single example of no platforming in British universities in the last year, it will have come from the liberal left. And as someone who thinks of himself still as being on the left, we have to own this and get rid of it. You know, we have to take responsibility for this particular branch of leftism which has infiltrated our universities and indeed our elites. And there could be no answer to that. It may be inconvenient, but it is a truth.